Hello everybody, welcome to the second module of our telecourse in which we will talk about spontaneous episodes of holotropic states that can create a transpersonal crisis, something that my late wife and Christina and I called spiritual emergency. That concept of spiritual emergency is probably the most important finding in the research of holotropic states, because it showed that there is a very significant, large category of these spontaneous episodes which are currently diagnosed and treated as manifestations of mental disease, as psychosis. And if they are properly understood and properly supported, they actually turn out to have extremely positive potential for transformation, for healing. They have tremendous heuristic value. They become a source of very important information about the psyche and consciousness and even the nature of reality. I believe they also have a great evolutionary potential. Now, to really understand the concept of spiritual emergency, I have to remind you of what we talked about in the last module, about the radical changes that we would have to make in psychiatry. And this is necessary for us to understand how states like this could be therapeutic, transformative, rather than pathological. So to see it this way, we have to have this large image, this large map of the psyche that includes not just postnatal biography, but includes the reliving of birth, the 4 perinatal matrices, as I called it, and this whole large transpersonal domain, which basically overlaps to some extent with Jung's idea about the collective unconscious. Then the second thing that we have to understand, that the roots of emotional psychosomatic problems don't go just to childhood and early childhood, but they go to birth and then beyond it into the transpersonal, into karmic matrices, into archetypal domain, into phylogenetic domain, animal ancestral domain. We also have to recognize that there are powerful healing mechanisms which become available if the psyche opens on the perinatal and the transpersonal level. And also that when the psyche gets activated in this holotropic state of consciousness, that it mobilizes the kind of self-healing intelligence, so that the manifestations of that kind of state would be indication of healing rather than being seen as a pathology, the organism trying to get rid of some traumatic imprint. Then the other thing, we have to accept spirituality as an extremely important dimension in the psyche and in the universal scheme of things, and also get a much different image of what consciousness is. It's not just the product of the brain. It is and kind of attribute of existence that we cannot explain or derive from anything else. It's as basic and as mysterious as existence itself. So if we look at the spiritual history of humanity, we will find many instances of what we would call spiritual emergency, when people were actually in crisis, people who were involved in the spiritual path, and they used some kind of methods that opened a lot of the psyche in a very fast way. So this is certainly something that we find in the history of shamanism. I already mentioned that the career of most shamans begins with a very powerful spontaneous episode of holotropic state, with the journey into the underworld and the magical flight into the supernal realms, and the self-healing that happens in it, and so on. We find this also in the history of the great yogis. Ramakrishna went through periods when the spiritual experiences were so powerful that he couldn't really take care of himself. He was to be supplied food, and supported by his disciples. Muktananda, in his book, the biography, The Play of Consciousness, described during his 40 years of spiritual traveling in India and visiting different masters, how he went through very stormy episodes that certainly would be in the West diagnosed as a psychotic break. We find it in the great religions as experiences of the founders who actually initiated the religions. So we have the history of the Buddha, for example, who was sitting under the bo tree and had this experience of the visitation of the world magician Kamamara, who was trying to threaten him with his army, and he's trying to bring his very seductive daughters, take him away from his spiritual ambition, and interest him in carnal things. It is the story of Mohammed, who had the experience of what has been referred to as his nocturnal journey, when he had the appearance of Archangel Gabriel, who took him through the 7 heavens, through Gehenna, which is the Muslim hell, and then through paradise. And in the 7th heaven, he had the experience that was described as ecstasy approaching annihilation, where he had communication with Allah and received the inspiration for the Quran. Jesus, had powerful experiences, which when he was 40 days in the desert, visitation of the devil who was trying to tempt him and so on. We find it in other figures in the Christian history. For example, Saul, having blinding vision of Jesus on the way to Damascus. We have it in Saint John of Patmos, in his cave, having the vision of the apocalypse and so on. We have it in some of the great teachers of Buddhism, for example, Padmasambhava, the great guru who brought Buddhism to Tibet, had sort of visionary experiences which he fought the local deities of the Bon religion, which preceded Buddhism in Tibet. There were a lot of saints who had experiences of these kinds of crises. That was Saint John of the Cross, who is known for his dark night of the soul. Saint Teresa of Avila experienced tortures in hell, choking hell that she talked about it, and the experience that an angel came with a sword and drove it through her heart. Some of the great mystics, Jacob Böhme, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard von Bingen, they all had episodes of very, very difficult, very taxing experiences that again in our Western context would get all psychiatric diagnoses, but they were important landmarks on their spiritual journey that they eventually tremendously benefited from. I guess there were not psychiatrists around who would sort of interrupt it for them. So our own history was that we worked with psychedelics, then later with the holotropic breathwork that we developed when we were at SLN. When people had powerful experiences and we had no way of telling them how deep or how far they can go. So for example, in my early years, I came equipped with psychoanalysis, where the idea is that there's nothing in the psyche that came in before birth. And of course, when I gave LSD to my patients, they would not stay in that very narrow space, and they started moving into dimensions for which at that time I didn't have any understanding. It turned out to be a reliving of birth, when people were through very, very difficult experiences, when at some stages of this perinatal process they had the feeling they were going permanently crazy. They had the feeling there's no way this can end in time, or there's no way this can open up. This was the time when they were experiencing the stage of birth where the uterus is contracting but the cervix is not open. It's a kind of a no exit situation. But we found very quickly that there's no good way of interrupting a bad trip, because if you give big dose of tranquilizers, you actually freeze it in that place and you prevent it from some kind of a positive resolution. So we simply stayed, and then we saw that after some of the most difficult, challenging experiences, there were major breakthroughs. And the same happened then when the experiences moved beyond birth and people started having past life experiences and archetypal experiences and so on. So what was happening, that there were experiences emerging which were on the same line, and they started with exploring childhood, and then it went into birth, and then it went beyond that into the transpersonal. So it was very difficult to say up to this point those are normal experiences, but once it becomes birth, or once it goes into the transpersonal, then we deal with pathology. And even more than that, we saw extremely positive results when people were able to, and we were able to support them to get through this. So we recognized in this that many of these spontaneous episodes of very powerful experiences, perinatal, transpersonal, are actually attempts of the organism to heal itself, something that should be supported rather than stopped. And we developed the concept of what we call spiritual emergency. The term spiritual emergency is a play on words. It's from the Latin emergere, which means emerging. And when something emerges unexpectedly and comes as a surprise and has some, challenge with it, we call it emergency vehicle, emergency room. But there's also that positive root emergere, the possibility of emerging to another level. So there's a certain ambiguity in that term. These kind of episodes are really, difficulties, challenges, nuisance in life. But at the same time, if they're properly treated, they have this positive potential to actually raising to another level of consciousness. And we use for it this example from the Chinese pictograms, where when we have the pictogram which describes crisis, it's composed of two other pictograms. One is danger and the other one is opportunity. So it's ultimately about the situation, the circumstances, whether it's going to go one way or another, whether it ultimately will look more like a crisis, or whether people manage to somehow turn it around and actually benefit from that situation. Now, when we realized that, Christina, who herself had very powerful crises of this kind, that turned out to be something that's called in Indian scriptures awakening of the Kundalini power of the serpent power. She became very, very deeply interested in this. And in 1980, she started at Esalen something that she called Spiritual Emergency Network, which is SEN Network. And we were in very interesting circumstances because Dick Price, who's the co-founder of Esalen, actually had 3 episodes, very powerful episodes like this himself. And during these first 2 episodes, he was taken to New Haven, to the Institute of Living, very kind of upscale psychiatric facility, and went through an incredible series of insulin comas and electroshocks. And when it happened the 3rd time, he decided not to go to psychiatrists anymore. There was a little log cabin at SLN, and he decided to just spend the time there and go with the experience. And he had a friend, Patrick, who was actually bringing him food and taking care of him, and he got through this episode, in a very, very positive way. Turned out to be absolutely fascinating, because many of those experiences took him to the time of Alexander the Great, when he was actually recognizing people and naming them by names. And I couldn't believe that the psychiatrist in New Haven would not think that this is fascinating and try to sort of explore it a little, what was happening there. It's certainly something that was very, very fascinating. So Dick Price was very sympathetic from the very beginning with this spiritual emergency network. He actually gave us a house and gave us several work scholars. There are people who come to SLN and they pay much less than the seminarians, but they have to do some work. They have to work in the garden, in the kitchen, in the bath, and so on. So their assignment was to have a computer, take phone calls from people, and bring together people who were having these experiences with people whom they had on the list as people who are capable to support it in an alternative way, rather than just the traditional psychiatric approach. So this was a referral system. Then it became so big that we couldn't handle it ourselves, and it went for a while to the California Institute of Transpersonal Studies, and they were using then students. They had a crisis telephone line where people could call, and they would talk with them and find out what would be the best referral for them if they had somebody in their environment who could support them in a way that they could benefit from this kind of experience. That it moved to the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where we got so far that it has its whole space with telephone lines and computer and that referral system. And then when the big economic cuts came, this was the most dispensable program at the school. So for a long time this was not really functioning. There was just a wonderful man, Ted Esser, who was willing to work on the line in spite of the fact that there was no money for him for that. And now, several months ago, we tried to resuscitate it again and find some funding for this service. So this was the Spiritual Emergence Network. Now, when we say that seeing these states as spiritual crises, as spiritual emergencies, rather than psychotic breaks, schizophrenic breaks, and so on, there are always some people, professionals, who will say, well, what is the differential diagnosis between spiritual emergency and psychosis? And we have to say, well, there is no differential diagnosis, because psychosis is not the diagnosis, you see. We like to use like a medical terminology, but this is not a diagnosis to which we are used in medicine, where you can find something in the blood, in the urine, in the in the X-rays, in the cerebrospinal liquid. This is a diagnosis that is made on the basis that these people have experiences and forms of behavior that the current model cannot explain. There's no clear way, medical way, that we could establish as a diagnosis. It's actually, these episodes would be called endogenous psychosis, And anybody who knows something about medicine knows that this is a cop-out. This is basically saying we don't have a clue. So for example, if somebody has epileptic seizure after a car accident, we would call it post-traumatic epilepsy. If they just start having epileptic seizures and we don't know why, we don't say, sorry, we don't know. We give a very learned kind of a title like this is idiopathic epilepsy or this is essential epilepsy. And so here it's functional psychosis or endogenous, which basically means generated from within. It's very difficult to set against it a differential diagnosis if it's really not a diagnosis. And so what was the alternative? The alternative was to define somehow the characteristics, the symptoms of this kind of a situation that would make that person a good candidate for an alternative approach rather than just giving them tranquilizers or some other medication to start with. So what are the signs that for us would say this is a good candidate, we would like to try to work with the person? The first thing is that we would see that what they are experiencing, the phenomenology, would be basically composed of the kind of experiences that we daily see in our holotropic breathwork, for example, or that would happen in psychedelic sessions. So that would be, they would be having some experiences of reliving memories from childhood, even infancy. They would have episodes for going through dying and being born, psychospiritual death, rebirth experience. They would have past life experiences. They would have visions of some archetypal beings, so they would visit some archetypal realms like paradises or heavens of different cultures and so on. Basically visiting the archetypal world. So that for us would be a sign that this might be a workable situation. I mean, if we would take people from the street, people who come to a weekend workshop, we would see a number of situations like this that would last 2 or 3 hours, and people would, have good resolution and benefit from it. So if we see it and it happens spontaneously, why don't we try the same kind of approach that we daily use in these other situations? Now, this other thing that is important really to start with is we have to have a good medical examination to be sure that we don't overlook something, whether it's a causal or whether it's just something that was a facilitating factor. We don't want to miss some kind of a serious medical condition. Then the other thing is we go by something that we call communication style. When Eugene Bloiler developed the term schizophrenia, which means split mind, one of the things that they were using for besides some of the main science and the secondary science, they were using the term Prägungsgefühl, which means praecox feeling. So that original term for schizophrenia was dementia praecox. And so the term praecox feeling meant when you sit with that patient, you somehow cannot relate to them. They are you have the feeling they are in another world. So you have praecox feelings about him. After you have had some experiences yourself in psychedelic sessions, you would not have a praecox feeling with somebody who is a good candidate for the alternative approach. You would actually be very likely recognizing experiences that you yourself had at one time or another when you were doing psychedelic sessions. And the communication style, also the way people talk about it. So if somebody is in what we call spiritual emergency and they are talking about it, it's like a person who just had 300 micrograms of LSD and is telling you wild stories, but in a very articulate way. So I will give 2 examples. One example would be a patient would be coming and says, the last 3 weeks I have had these powerful energies in sort of awakening in my body. They're flowing up my spine. They make me shake. I have visions, sometimes like visions of some mythological sequences, or I have the feeling that I'm wake up at night and it seems like I've been in another country. I have waves of emotions that I don't know where they are coming from. Suddenly become angry and suddenly become anxious. What do you think is happening to me? Am I going crazy? And to that kind of person, you would say, well, you might be going through a difficult stage of a process that might actually be useful, might be therapeutic, might be transformative. So that would be one kind of approach. The other person would be telling you something like, I have this evil neighbor and he's after me, he's trying to destroy me. He has put bugging devices all through my house. He must have dug out some kind of connection from his cellar to my cellar. He gets at night into my house, he gets into my refrigerator, poisons my food. And then you ask, why would we be doing it? He says, well, he's really on the payroll of the mafia. The mafia wants to destroy me, because they don't like certain parts of my character. And actually the money for this goes from Middle East. These are all petrodollars. You get a kind of a wild story that is very difficult to relate to, no matter how many psychedelic sessions you have had. Then you get the kind of the praecox feeling, I can't really relate to this story. There's another element that has to be present. The person has to be willing to cooperate. You have to have a sense that you have a good enough working relationship, and the person has to be interested in this. So even if you give them the alternative, either give them tranquilizers, something that would sort of suppress these kinds of situations, and the possibility of working on it. And you say, you might go through some difficult experiences on the way where we do it, but there's a chance that you benefit from it, that you get through it. The person might really go for it, might be excited about it, particularly those people where it started by some kind of spiritual practice, when they were spiritual practitioners already, and these technologies of the sacred developed in these spiritual systems just worked too well and opened up a lot. But they would prefer for it to be continued with the same kind of a strategy rather than stopping that process, because even if it's very painful, even if it's very difficult, these people usually have the feeling that there is something really valuable happening. Now, on the other side, they can say, listen, I have had enough of these inner experiences, just give me something so I can sleep. I have had enough. Then it's very legitimate, but it's very different from, say, the scientific way of treating this is to snow you with tranquilizers. When people see the alternatives, they can make a choice. So while you can do something like tranquilizing medication against the will of the patient, so that happened many times, for this you really need cooperation, you need consent, you need a good relation with the person that you are doing it with. So that's the differential diagnosis. So okay, then we can look at the next aspect of this, and this is what are the triggers? What are the usual triggers of those kinds of situations? We'll find out that it covers an extremely broad spectrum. So there's one category of these triggers that are actually physical in nature. So this would be accidents, it would be operations, diseases. This could be some extreme physical exertion. This could be insomnia, sleep deprivation, and in many instances this could be childbirth or miscarriage can cause that. And we have had instances where this can happen in a powerful sexual experience. Actually, there's a wonderful work that Jenny Wade has done, a psychologist, who studied specifically transpersonal experiences that people had triggered by sexual contact. The second one would be factors which are psychological factors. This would be factors like death, like a serious loss, death of a child, death of a relative, of parents, or an important friend, or a teacher. This could be loss of a relationship, a divorce, or just a breakup of a love affair. This could be a series of failures, loss of a job, for example. This could be also unresolved psychedelic experience or unresolved experience of some powerful non-drug experiential therapy. And basically any kind of major emotional experience can do something like this. Then we have also the next one, which would be actually spiritual reasons, spiritual triggers. Many of these spiritual systems, religions developed what I call the technology of the sacred, some procedures that help people to have a spiritual experience. Combination, for example, of fasting, long-term meditation, prayers, meditation or movement meditation, and so on. Practice of yoga, Taoist meditation, participation in a Sufi zikr. We have seen it under all these kinds of circumstances. So those are designed to actually induce spiritual experiences. And again, if they're very successful, then it can just bring a lot out. And we have visited quite a few monasteries and talked to spiritual groups. We were trying to find out what they do when something like this happens. And we were surprised how really little skill there was in dealing with these situations. Mostly it was in like you stop, meditate, and you go and work in the garden, or wash the corridors or bathrooms and so on. Bring yourself down. But we haven't found any situations where somebody would really do active work, encouraging people to express the emotions and do maybe some body work and releasing the energies that became available from those blockages and so on. So those are the three categories: physical factors, emotional factors, and spiritual factors. Now, as you see, this is a very, very broad spectrum, and the question: what is the common final pathway? What is the common denominator? Why should all those be able to trigger spiritual emergency? So the best way I can understand it is that this is basically the question about the relationship between the unconscious and the consciousness, and the defenses which are holding down the unconscious material. So basically it changes the relationship. So anything that can weaken the defenses or that can activate the unconscious material can cause this. Now the other situation, which is very important, is that there is a certain reciprocal relationship between our emotional investment in the external world and the attention that we pay to our inner life. If we have sort of a lot of attraction from the external world, that is at the expense of any kind of a self-exploration, any kind of tendency to understand one's inner world. So if we have a strong vision, like the American dream, we go for a lot of money, big bank account, big car, big house, and we have a lot of plans that we pursue. There's very little time to do some kind of an inner work. Now, when this starts collapsing, let's say suddenly marriage breaks down or an important relationship, and we lose a job, and the economic situation changes. Suddenly not even people from college, guarantee that they get a job and so on. And it's not possible anymore that one person can feed a family. And so people's positive perspective starts sort of falling down. This is where they are thrown back on their own psyche. It activates, they become much more aware of what's happening inside. So this is why so many different situations can be found as the potential triggers of that kind of a situation. Now then, the other thing that Christina and I were looking into was, are there some definable forms or types of these kinds of experiences? Something that psychiatrists are trying to do with what's called DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a very sad story because we already have DSM-5. There are always fights about what's going into that. So we have always these struggles, and the result is not great. The clinicians keep complaining that they cannot find those descriptions of what they see in their patient. They cannot find it in that book. And there's also, different psychiatrists see it differently, and different countries have different diagnostic manuals. Simply, the psychiatric problems are not easy to put into these kind of pigeonholes, that would be clearly defined the way it is in medicine, where we can really back it up with findings in the blood, in the urine, in X-rays, in the cerebrospinal liquid, and so on. In medicine, it is possible that you make a wrong diagnosis, that somebody who's a better doctor is going to prove you that it's wrong, and as a result, your therapy is wrong. In psychiatry, we don't have any clear criteria. Somebody would sort of convince you that you made a bad diagnosis, and if you even agree on the diagnosis, it doesn't commit you to any kind of specific treatment. The way it is in medicine, you have to diagnose the infection because different infections respond to different antibiotics or different medicines of some other kind. Anemias are different anemias that respond to to different medication and so on. Whereas in psychiatry, you have a situation where there were psychiatrists who have been trying to do psychotherapy with schizophrenics, and there are people who were shocking neurotic patients. So this doesn't really commit you to any kind of specific treatment, as much as they are trying to do it now. That when you have a certain patient, you might get a list of diagnoses from which you have to choose, and with this comes recommended medication and recommended time of hospitalization. But in psychiatry, this simply does not work. And of course, we were not able to do it in relation to spiritual emergency. Now, what's happening in spiritual emergency is that the psyche opens up, and there are no partitions in the psyche. This is a multi-level, multi-dimensional system, so that you are not going to end up with some kind of boxes that you can sort of specifically define and demarcate and separate from others. But what we have been able to do was that there are certain situations where there is a specific accumulation of certain manifestations that are sufficient to talk about it as a type of spiritual emergency. But in practice, you find that there's overlapping. There are certain things that would appear in more than one form. For example, that element of psychospiritual death rebirth that we talked about in the first module, that is characteristic for the shamanic crisis, but you can also find it in some other types of spiritual emergency, or the psychospiritual death rebirth. You can also find enhanced psychic ability, extrasensory perception. You can find it in several of those types. But with these kinds of limitations, we were able to identify certain units within that. I have a long list, and I will be able to just give several, some of the most important examples, not to go into all of them. So the first one would be the shamanic initiatory crisis. This is something that we talked about in detail, something that happened spontaneously in these native cultures as a shamanic initiation crisis, or what anthropologists call shamanic disease. It also happens to people who are using series of psychedelic sessions, or who are using series of holotropic breathwork. We had actually individuals, participants in these events, that repeatedly would go into this kind of shamanic experience to the point that they decide to go and become apprentices of shamans. They go to Mexico or to Peru and decide that they need some kind of expert guidance for that particular kind of spiritual opening. And even I remember few that incorporated shamanic practices into their psychological, psychotherapeutic practice in United States. Now, the second very important type that we have been able to identify is actually the one that Christina had, which turned out to be the activation of Kundalini, activation of the serpent power, as it is called in the yogic literature. There, the idea is that this Kundalini is a cosmic energy, cosmic creative energy that has its representation in the human subtle body, not the physical body, but the subtle, body, in the sacral area, where it is in a kind of a dormant form. She's usually represented as the snake, which is coiled 3.5 times around a kind of male generative principle, which is called lingam, Shiva lingam. And that term Kundalini actually means the coiled one. It's a kind of an archetypal form that's given to this force. And it's kind of in this dormant, slumbering form in the sacral area, in the energetic body, and can get activated by a variety of factors. One most common is what's called Shaktipat, actually contact with a Kundalini guru, that I have the reputation of awaken this Kundalini, which could be through touch, it could be through look. Muktananda, with whom we spent quite a bit of time, actually had a wand of peacock feathers, scented with sandalwood, and was hitting people over the head or over the shoulder, and people started having powerful experiences after that kind of a procedure, Shaktipat. There are also very dangerous, forceful maneuvers that some people use, which are considered very dangerous, which include something like compressing the carotids and blocking the influx of blood into the brain, and all kinds of other situations. In Christina's case, it was the birth of her son that started this. She started having powerful experiences and got a big shot of morphine and then some tranquilizers. And then it got again reactivated when she gave birth to her daughter Sarah 2 years later. And after that time, it was kind of coming and going. And then she met Muktananda and got this Shaktipat, and then it really took the lid off, and it started going very, very strongly. And she went to consult Joe Campbell, who was her teacher at Sarah Lawrence, and wanted some help. And Joe Campbell said that he's just interested in these things. Theoretically, he's just teaching and writing about it, but he really wants to keep his feet firmly on the ground. And by that time Joe and I were friends, so he sent Christina to me. And so we spent 8 years actually dealing with this process and learning how to deal with it. So when that Kundalini gets activated, it becomes what they call Shakti. In other words, it becomes an active energy that seems to be flowing up through the energy body. If you see the diagrams for it, there's a central column which is called, or conduit, which is called Shushubna, and the Ida and Pindala are represented like the staff of Asclepius, kind of like crossing, and wherever they cross, there are the chakras, there are the centers of spiritual energy. And as the energy is ascending, it seems to be activating the memories of traumatic experiences. It's kind of loosening them and bringing them into consciousness for processing. So people go through a lot of waves of unmotivated emotions, or a lot of bursts of energies which are flying through the body and cause shaking and so on. They can see visions of light, visions of deities. They can have past life experiences, or other manifestations which are of activated Kundalini, which are referred to as kriyas, the combinations of emotions, physical feelings, and some visual experiences, or acoustic experiences also very frequently. And then the idea is that the energy can go through the chakras until it reaches the Sahasrara, and this is a process that's considered generally benign, healing, leading to spiritual opening, but also one that has the greatest risks of any kind of a spiritual pathways. I was in 1971, I was in New Delhi in India on the first scientific conference on yoga, and I gave a talk on the parallel between psychedelic experiences and experiences from the Indian spiritual systems, Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. And there were a lot of yogis and spiritual teachers, including Krishnamurti present and so on. And they concluded that the work with psychedelics comes closest to one system of the Indian spiritual system, which is a Kundalini Yoga, which is the most powerful but also most dangerous, most problematic potentially. And the general agreement was that the worst you can do is to trying to stop it. That really, the safest way to do it is you go with it and just let the energy do whatever it wants to do. And that's the best situation for the positive outcome. That was the agreement of that palaver of the yogis that came there. Before we continue to the next type, I would like to show a picture of Christina at the time when this process was really, really intense. And at that time we were doing a workshop at SLN, and we were ending the workshop, and we stood on the deck at SLN, and somebody wanted to take our photograph, and this was done by a Polaroid camera, so we saw it coming out of the camera, and it was showing her, light in the place where she would have their chakras. And there was a group of researchers from Belgium that came to the month-long that we did at SLN after this, and they were interested in developing a camera that would be able to register inner energy. So they were experts about the interaction between the film and light, and they concluded that there was nothing in the visible spectrum of light that could cause these kinds of situations on the film. So that was a kind of an interesting episode in this whole Kundalini awakening. Okay, so we go to the next one. What you see, this is a young Abraham Maslow, very, very famous American psychologist, professor, who studied several hundred of spontaneous mystical experiences and defined one category which he called a peak experience. So this is a form of spiritual emergency that's very benign, that doesn't seem to bring any kind of dangers or problems. And if it's not allowed to run, this is just a problem for the psychiatrist. There's no reason why you shouldn't sort of allow people to finish this, because as Maslow has shown, this can have very beneficial, very powerful impact on personality. Be ultimately conducive to what he called self-realization or self-actualization, really expressing fully one's own potential, liberating all the latent capacities that you have. He took on the academic community and he showed them that this was happening in people who in no way could be identified as psychiatric patients. There was just no reason to see this as a pathological, and that these were supernormal, if anything, rather than an abnormal or subnormal kinds of experiences. Now, this was then taken on by Walter Pahnke, who was a very interesting man. It's this picture here, who was like an eternal student. He got a MD from Harvard, added a PhD degree and topped it with a divinity degree. So when he joined us at Spring Grove in Baltimore in the psychedelic research program, this was his first real job. Until that point, he was studying and he was traveling and learning. But he had the ideal qualification for the study that he initiated and the two of us then led in Baltimore at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, which was the work with psychedelics, LSD, MDA, and dipropyltryptamine with terminal cancer patients. He had medical degree, psychological degree, and divinity degree, and we were studying to what extent mystical experiences can help these people with the fear of death and can transform dying. Probably the most interesting program that we did was like half a century ago, and now after this dark period when no research was possible, the American universities are returning to psychedelic research, and that repeating this work with cancer patients particularly popular. So Walter, was a kind of a daredevil, like it seemed indestructible, but actually died in the year 1971. He went scuba diving in a second-hand equipment and not even with a marker. He went for a dive before lunch in Maine, and he never disappeared. He never returned from the Atlantic. He just disappeared. His body or the equipment has never been found. So he and I were preparing patients to die, and many of his patients survived him. He was already gone, and they were still more there for a couple of years. So he became fascinated by this study. He's somebody who did a very famous experiment, which is called the Good Friday experiment, where he actually created a questionnaire based on Maslow and also Stace, and he did this experiment on Good Friday in the Marsh Chapel, and gave a medication, the double-blind basis, to 20 students of theology. Half of them got psilocybin, half of them got what was considered active placebo, which was niacin from the group of vitamin B. that can give you hot flashes and make you itch. So it was a very problematic placebo because, after an hour everybody knew who had what. Half of the people were scratching and half of the people were having powerful experiences. So this experiment basically proved that there was no way of differentiating the experiences induced by psilocybin from the experiences, spiritual experiences described in the spiritual literature. And it's interesting that recently this study was repeated with a much better methodology at Johns Hopkins by Roland Griffith and Bill Richards. And it was published. Johns Hopkins scientists proved that psilocybin can induce mystical experiences. So when I saw it, I was very excited that the research is again possible. But then I felt, do I really need scientists and methodology to prove to me that I had, mystical experience with psilocybin? So maybe we can show this little list of characteristics of the peak experience, the way Pankey extracted it from Abraham Maslow. So, as I mentioned, this is the most benign. It doesn't produce any challenges, any problems for people. It just needs to go, somewhere where you are in privacy and you can really let this run. The first item is experience of unity, which is experience of inner and outer unity. You have the feeling that everything within you sort of came together into wholeness and oneness, and you also feel one with the environment, with other people, with nature, with the universe. The second characteristic is a strong positive emotion, which could be anything from real ecstatic rapture to something that has been described as the peace, tranquility, peace that passes all imagination. So tranquility, peace, or ecstatic, even ecstatic rapture. Another characteristic is transcendent of time and space. You suddenly feel that you are outside of the ordinary time-space coordinates, somewhere sort of where these categories don't apply anymore. Then sense of sacredness that Jung, using the term from Otto Paul, called numinosity. And Jung liked this as a good alternative to terms like mystical, spiritual, religious, magical, and so on, because it's really neutral. When we use terms like religious, mystical, people have very specific association. It has been used in different contexts, whereas that term numinosity basically means that you find yourself in some reality that is radically different from the one that you know from everyday reality. And usually it feels like it's superordinated, that it's actually a higher level of reality from which the level where we live is kind of formed and informed, very much like the Platonic archetypes. There's also paradoxical nature. When I described my own experience, I said I felt like I became nothing, and by becoming nothing, I became everything. So be nothing and everything at the same time. Or you can have the feeling that forms are empty and emptiness has forms, and so on. So all kinds of paradoxes that you hear, or you feel that you are an insignificant part of the universe, but they are also the whole universe at the same time, or that you are separate from other people, but that you are all one. So the paradoxicality is always found in the accounts of people who had these experiences. And the other one is ineffability, that you find it very difficult to communicate to people what you have experienced. And people who are sophisticated, who are well read in spiritual literature, they usually go to foreign languages. They go to cultures that are more sophisticated in self-exploration and consciousness exploration than we are. So they use terms like samsara or maya, or the Hindus have a lot of categories of samadhis. They can sort of samikalpa samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi. Whereas our language developed in such a way that we just describe things that happen in everyday life, and that language simply is not appropriate for talking about mystical experiences. And when people try to do that, they do what psychiatric patients typically do, which is they capitalize. I felt love, but it was not love. It was like love with a capital letter. Or the God created, in Kabbalah, God created the world because of boredom, but it has to be boredom with capital B. So it's not that's when I get bored in my everyday life. There was another one, was objectivity and reality of the insights, which means when we have that experience of those other realities, they actually can feel more real than what we experience in everyday life. So that it feels like awakening, like we slept or we were sort of hypnotized when we were in everyday life, and the much deeper reality was hidden in that state for us. I mean, we have now opened up to it. We have now awakened. So it feels very objective and real. Then the next one is quite difficult to describe. It's acquisition of wisdom of a very, very fundamental nature. This is called Prajna Paramita in the Eastern terminology. And it is a recipe against something that's called avidya, which means ignorance. Okay? But again, it's not ignorance of some facts about the material world. It's ignorance. Avidya is ignorance about some very fundamental features of reality, like what is the nature of reality? Who am I really? It's not knowing my anatomy or physiology and so on, things that science studied. So those are really insights of cosmic relevance into very, very nature of existence itself. So that's called the Prajna Paramita. Something similar is found in the Upanishads. They talk about knowing that, the knowing of which gives you knowledge of everything. But the knowledge is kind of a meta-knowledge. It's not, knowledge of details. It's like a understanding what existence is about. And then the last category that Pankey isolated was positive after effects, lasting positive after effects after these experiences. So very, very therapeutic, very transformative, if they are allowed to complete themselves, if you don't get on tranquilizers. Now this is now a picture of John Perry, very, very interesting Jungian analyst who died several years ago. He was one of the pioneers of this kind of alternative approach to psychosis. He developed two centers. One was called Diabasis, which means crossing over, in San Francisco. The other one was called Chrysalis, which is a reference to metamorphosis. This one was in San Diego. And in these centers, he wanted to have people who had the first episode of this kind of a spiritual emergency, a holotropic state of consciousness, before people are labeled by psychiatrists and are told that they are mentally ill and so on, started on tranquilizers. He believed that first discussion can really determine which direction it's going to go. That you meet a professional with the authority of a scientist and so on tells you, this is a very serious mental disease. You have to be prepared to take probably on and off tranquilizers for the rest of your life. That's kind of one message with one label, and to tell them, I think you are involved in a very difficult stage of a process that in and of itself can be transformative, can be healing, and will be here with you and will be helping you. That's a very powerful message. And there are other things that then snowball from there, and the results are very, very different. So these people who were treated by John Perry, they did not take any tranquilizers. They were encouraged just to go through whatever they were going through. And John was meeting with them and was sort of processing and helping them to integrate the experiences using the big maps of the psyche that Jung brought, including the collective unconscious and so on. Now, this is the most profound experience of spiritual emergency, one that most likely would be diagnosed as schizophrenia. And yet this is the most powerful argument against this to be seen as a pathological process. Now, people who are in this form of spiritual emergency, they have the sense that there is some kind of a cosmic battle that started happening, that a battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light, something like a Manichaean kind of, or a Zoroastrian, Ormus and Ahriman, or something like that. And that the whole fate of the world is at stake, and that they have some kind of a central role in this. There's a lot of things that have to do with death, which could be martyrdom, sacrifice, death, rebirth, so on. There could be homosexual panic. They might have the feeling they are turning into the opposite gender, for example. There is an experience of what the Jungians call hieros gamos, sacred marriage, that could be played out intrapsychically, that the person has the feeling of this sacred marriage with a partner, something like in alchemy, sort of king and the queen, or sun and the moon, or some kind of elevated archetypal figures. Or some of the patients project it. They feel that there is a soulmate, there's a sacred partner sort of in the environment, and they might get kind of difficult because they try to convince that person that they are soulmates, and of course the other person doesn't know anything about it. Women sometimes have the feeling that they are pregnant and they are going to give birth to the savior, and the people, men are more feeling that they might become saviors or play some important role in the world. Kind of messianic kind of delusions can come. Now, after some time of these kinds of experiences, people start experiencing kind of a radiant center inside of their body, which, as a Jungian, John Perry described as a symbol, archetypal symbol of the self, a higher self. And this is represented as a radiant sphere, or as a diamond, or a pearl, or something similar. And then they sort of connect with it and identify with it. And then the personality gets kind of reconstructed from there, from that center. So for John, this breakdown, that's seen as pathology, was really a powerful restitutive process. The pathology was the impoverished personality of that patient as a result of their history, family history and so on. They were really traumatized and impoverished somehow, and this was tearing down that whole structure that was created by the history, and they took it back. This is we call it renewal process by descent to the central archetype, and then recognizing their true nature, and then building up the personality from there. There were all kinds of other things that Jung also pointed to. At a certain stage, these patients spontaneously started attempting the quadrature of the circle. They started painting mandalas that combined a square and a circle. And in Tantra and also in Jungian psychology, the circle is the is the symbol of the transcendental, and the square is the grounding. We talk about people being square. Okay? This is found in sacred architecture in Babylonia, Assyria, ziggurats, or in all over Europe. There used to be medieval fountains, wells, which have a square basis and then the circular form. And they, sooner or later, then they start paying attention to the environment. They start kind of returning, and then they recognize that this was not a cosmic battle at all, that this was just their own inner drama. And then after average, John said, after average 42 days, that those people tended to come and integrate that experience. Now, why does this seems so really so out there? Why is this particularly powerful argument against this being pathology? Now, John, being extremely well educated, as the Jungians usually are, he somehow realized and discovered that the themes that were emerging in this kind of process were exactly the same as the themes in certain New Year's dramas that were performed in societies, ancient societies, at a particular time. He called it the archaic era of incarnated myth. This is the time when the cultures believed that their ruler is literally God. Like in Egypt, they believed that the pharaoh was God. This was not an ordinary being. The same, the Incas, they believed the main Inca was a god. The Hittites, the ancient Hebrews, certainly the Japanese and the Chinese. In Japan, it still exists. I've talked to people who think that the emperor is God. And you might remember that after the Second World War, MacArthur forced Hirohito to show up and say, "Listen, folks, I'm not God, I'm just an ordinary human being." So in cultures that had this kind of a belief system, they had New Year's ceremonies where they had a royal drama, when they had the king exactly in that same kind of roles that are now enacted somehow in this form of a spiritual emergency. So that would have to be some pathological process that would sort of produce something like this. So basically the argument was, this is so clearly related to the evolution of consciousness, that to see it as pathology is just, doesn't make any sense. So his conclusion was, what happens, these were, historically, these were cultures that were willing to accept that there were certain persons that were gods and that they were just ordinary human beings, subjects. And that this process kind of democratizes, that ordinary people realize their own divinity, like everybody, in a sense, becomes God. But that the trick is not to walk out and, want to be treated like one. You have to realize that other people have the same potential, so nothing changed except your understanding. So you go and wash dishes and you just know that it's God incarnate washing dishes. You don't think that, you should call President Trump to tell them that there's now, God, Jesus or whatever, walking in the United States and want to be a church being formed for you. So this is a very fascinating one. John wrote it in a number of books. The first one that I became aware of was The Far Side of Madness. There was a last one that he got when he, just few days before he died, of a melanosarcoma of his retina, which was called Trials of the Visionary Mind. And then there were a few in between. The most interesting one was called Lord of the Four Quarters, when he actually went through these mythologies of the cultures from the archaic era of incarnate myth, when he was comparing these patients with those stories there. So we have so far discussed, several of the most important types. And you saw before that there is a longer list, which we don't have time in this context to go through. But I will be very happy to send you the PowerPoint itself, where it's summarized. You get a good sense for what these types are. And if you would get interested beyond that, Christine and I wrote 2 books. One is our own on the topic of spiritual emergency, which describes all those types. It's called The Stormy Search for the Self. And then we also edited a book, which is a compendium of papers by other people talking about this subject, beginning with the classical paper by Roberto Assagioli, the founder of Psychosynthesis in Italy, in Florence. It's called A Crisis of Spiritual Opening, but there are also papers by John Perry himself, by Jung, by Jack Hornfield, who's a wonderful Vipassana teacher. There is a story of Anne Armstrong, a great American psychic, clairvoyant, who went through 20 years of this kind of crisis before a very mature, very grounded psychic talent emerged out of it. So to the extent you're really interested in this type, there will be many opportunities to find about all those types and in considerable detail. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll connect again in the next module.